So, how in the world do you even begin to grade a presidency as polarizing as Donald Trump's? Well, we're going to dive into one pretty provocative analysis that tries to do exactly that. But this isn't your typical pros and cons list. Nope, this whole report card is built around one single, really complex question.
And that question, right there, kicks off a deeply contradictory answer. The source text we're digging into paints a picture of a leader who's responsible for what it calls both enormous achievements and disastrous failures. So let's see exactly how this unconventional report card gets filled out.
All right, so first up, let's look at the good side of the report card. The author starts by listing what they consider to be Trump's major accomplishments, actions that, in their view, no other administration would have ever delivered. Now, the source doesn't just list policy moves, it actually frames them as enormous achievements. According to the author, these actions are all about national sovereignty and, cultural preservation. Things like closing the border, trying mass deportations, freeing January 6 protesters, and pushing back against DEI initiatives. The analysis also gives Trump credit for fighting what it sees as anti-Americanism in government and for defending traditional values from the legal system.
But just as quickly as the praise comes, it's followed by some really sharp criticism. The author seems incredibly frustrated, arguing that right alongside these supposed achievements, Trump is also responsible for what the source calls disastrous failings in other really critical areas.
And wow, the severity of these criticisms is pretty striking. The author straight up alleges Trump supported a genocide, committed an act of war against Iran, and chose to just give orders to Russia instead of actually doing diplomacy. The analysis also hits on environmental policies, like opening the Alaska Wildlife Refuge to drilling and using the war on drugs as a cover for action in Venezuela. To the author, this all paints a picture of a leader who, to borrow a phrase once used about George W. Bush, speaks as if he owns the world. So you can see the huge contradiction here, right? This is the core of it. On one side, you have actions the author sees as defending the nation, and on the other, actions described as aggressive and destructive. According to this analysis, both of these things are true at the same time, which makes for one very conflicted final grade.
And this whole complicated picture, it doesn't just stop at domestic policy. The analysis takes this unconventional view and applies it to Trump's dealings with Vladimir Putin, arguing that most Western commentators are totally missing the real story.
Okay, so here's the claim. Apparently, there was this key understanding reached between Trump and Putin during a meeting in Alaska. Putin supposedly believed they had agreed on something huge, that they would deal with the root cause of the Ukraine conflict, which the source says is Western hostility and NATO expansion, before any ceasefire could even be discussed.
The author lays it out like this. First, you have the initial agreement, tackle the root cause, then talk ceasefire. But then, the source claims, Trump's advisors jumped in, talking about U.S. interests and weapons sales. And that allegedly led to a complete 180, with Trump now demanding a ceasefire before any talks. And the author's key point here is that Putin is supposedly still holding out hope that Trump will go back to that original deal.
But hey, the author isn't letting Putin off the hook either. Far from it. They really question his judgment and his reliance on what they call pro-Western advisors. The analysis points to that $300 billion in frozen Russian assets, and this drawn-out war is proof of these mistakes. And crucially, the author argues that Putin's red lines that never get enforced have just convinced the West that he can be pushed around without any real consequences. It's a dynamic the source believes is turning what could have been a limited conflict into a potential world war. So, this brings us to a really big question in this analysis. I mean, if the author sees both Trump and Putin as making these massive misjudgments, then are the leaders themselves really the main issue? Or is there some deeper underlying force at play here that's pushing everything forward?
Well, the source argues that, yes, there is a deeper force at play. The analysis shifts away from the individual leaders to identify what it sees as the true systemic drivers of the conflict, these forces that just keep chugging along no matter who's in the White House or the Kremlin.
And at the heart of this argument is something called the Wolfowitz Doctrine. This is a U.S. foreign policy goal that, according to the source, popped up after the Soviet Union collapsed. And its main goal is pretty simple: prevent any new rival from challenging America's top spot on the world stage. For the author, this doctrine isn't just some dusty old policy. They claim it's the invisible script that's guiding events today.
So when you boil it all down, the author's core idea comes down to two giant roadblocks to peace. First, you've got the Western military security complex, which, makes a lot of money from war. And second, you have that unwavering commitment to U.S. dominance, the Wolfowitz Doctrine.
The analysis concludes that these two forces work together to create a system that doesn't just allow for conflict, it actively creates it.
And that all leads to this really stark and honestly pretty pessimistic conclusion, straight from the author. The belief is that the drive for profit and for geopolitical power are just so strong that they're more important than avoiding a wider war. And because of that, the author believes conflict isn't just possible, it's likely.
And to back up this pretty grim prediction, the author doesn't just stick to theory. They point to what's happening in the news right now as real-world proof that the system is pushing us all towards a bigger conflict.
First up, the author points to reports that the U.S. is pushing the EU to use Russia's frozen assets to buy American-made weapons for Ukraine. In the author's eyes, this is a perfect example of that military security complex's profit motive in action.
And the second piece of evidence is the news that France might be willing to send troops to Ukraine as part of a security guarantee after a ceasefire. Now, the author doesn't see this as a good sign or a de-escalation. Instead, they see it as proof that the conflict is just continuing to widen, planting the seeds for whatever comes next.
And so, we're left with this final, really challenging idea from this analysis. A world where individual leaders, no matter how powerful they seem, might just be players in a much larger system, one that's driven by profit, and a strategy that prefers conflict over peace. The question the source leaves us with isn't just whether a system like that exists, but if it does, is there any way to escape its pull?